Some men never learned to talk to people. Kalen Moss was one of them. 7 years he'd lived alone on his homestead, and in all that time he'd spoken maybe a dozen words to another human being. He liked it that way. Talking meant questions. Questions meant answers he didn't have. People looked right through him like he was nothing, so he'd made himself nothing on purpose. But one night, everything shattered. The sound came just after moonrise, a wet, rattling gasp from inside his barn. Not one of his animals, something else, someone else. Kalen stood in his doorway, lantern shaking in his grip, every nerve screaming at him to lock the door and pretend he'd heard nothing. That's what 7 years of hiding had taught him. But his feet moved anyway. Across the yard, toward the barn door that hung open, the door he always latched. Always. Inside, the lantern threw wild shadows across the hay. That's when he saw her. She lay crumpled like a broken doll, dark hair spilled across her shoulders, leather clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, soaked black with blood. Too much blood. Her breathing came shallow and uneven. An Apache. The word hit him like a fist to the chest. Kalen knew the stories. He knew the fear. Harboring someone like this could get him killed, and worse things than killed. He should have walked away, should have ridden for the nearest settlement, should have let someone else handle this impossible situation. But her eyes opened. They locked onto his with an intensity that froze every muscle in his body. No fear, no pleading, just a silent assessment, like she was deciding whether he was worth staying conscious for. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he'd never heard. Then her hand shifted, revealing something carved into the dirt beneath her, symbols drawn in her own blood. His throat closed completely. She wasn't just hiding, she was leaving a message. For who? Her people? Her pursuers? And why here? Why his barn? Why tonight? The one night he'd actually heard the door. He knelt beside her. The lantern caught the rise and fall of her chest, each breath weaker than the last. She needed help. He had no idea how to give. The nearest settlement was hours away. She'd never survive the journey. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with shocking strength. Her eyes bore into his. She spoke one word, sharp, clear, desperate. A name, a warning, a command. Then he heard the horses. Distant thunder rolling across the valley, but getting closer, fast. Kalen's mind raced through every possibility, each one worse than the last. If those riders found her here, they'd assume he was involved. Complicit. Maybe even the one who'd hurt her. They'd drag him from his home, seize his land, destroy the careful distance he'd spent 7 years building, all shattered in one violent night. But her grip on his wrist hadn't loosened. He made his decision between one heartbeat and the next. Grabbed an armful of hay and scattered it over her blood-drawn symbols, hiding them completely. Then he lifted her, surprised by how light she felt despite the strength in her hands, and carried her deep into the barn, past the empty stalls to the back corner where winter supplies sat stacked under a tarp. He laid her behind the grain sacks, pulled the canvas down like a curtain, pressed his hand gently against her shoulder. Her eyes opened again. Understanding flickered there. She nodded once, then went still. Kalen emerged from the barn just as 3 riders crested the ridge. They wore no uniforms, no badges, nothing that marked them as law. Just men with rifles and expressions that said they asked questions with their fists, not their mouths. The lead rider pulled up short, his horse snorting and stamping. He was older, with a scar that split his left eyebrow. "You see anyone come through here?" Kalen's throat went tight. Speaking to strangers, his worst nightmare made flesh. He forced himself to shake his head, keeping his eyes down the way he always did. "Don't play dumb." The rider leaned forward in his saddle. Apache woman, injured. She couldn't have gotten far. Another rider circled toward the barn. Kalen's pulse hammered against his ribs. If they searched inside, if they moved the tarp, if they found the blood-soaked straw, if... Check the barn, the scarred man ordered. Kalen stepped forward before he could stop himself. The movement was small, barely a shuffle, but it put him between the riders and the barn door. All three men turned to stare. Something you want to say? The scarred man's hand drifted toward his rifle. Kalen opened his mouth. No words came. They never did when it mattered. His face burned with familiar shame, unable to function like a normal person, unable to defend himself, unable to... He's simple, the third rider said, disgust dripping from every syllable. Look at him. Probably doesn't even know what day it is. The scarred man studied Kalen for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. Waste of time. She's probably halfway to the canyon by now. He wheeled his horse around. Come on! They rode off, silhouettes disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they'd appeared. Kalen stood frozen in his yard, listening to hoofbeats fade into silence. His hands shook, his chest felt crushed, but she was still hidden, still safe. For now. He returned to the barn and pulled back the tarp. Her eyes were open, watching him with that same intense assessment, but something had changed. The way she looked at him now carried a weight he couldn't understand. She lifted her hand and touched 2 fingers to her chest, then extended them toward him. A gesture, a promise, a debt acknowledged. And Kalen realized with creeping dread that saving her life might have been the easy part. Kalen had never tended anything more complex than a fence post splinter. Now he knelt beside a woman bleeding from a gash that ran shoulder to ribs, with no idea what to do and no one to ask. He'd brought water from the well, clean cloth torn from his spare shirt, and a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for winters that felt too long. She watched him approach, jaw set against pain she refused to show. When he poured the whiskey over the wound, her entire body went rigid. Not a sound, not a whimper, just her hand curling into a fist so tight her knuckles went white. Kalen had cried out the time he'd burned his palm on the stove. This woman was enduring something 10 times worse and wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing her break. He worked as gently as he could, cleaning and binding the wound with cloth strips. His hands shook the entire time, not from fear of her, but from the reality of being this close to another person. He could smell the leather of her clothing, the copper tang of blood, the faint scent of sage in her hair. When he finished, she caught his wrist again. This time her grip was weaker, but deliberate. She guided his hand to the symbols she'd drawn earlier, now hidden under hay. Then she pressed his palm flat against the barn floor and dragged it in a straight line away from the marks. Away. She was telling him to stay away. Kalen's throat tightened. Why? Were they a warning? A boundary? Something sacred he'd violated by covering them? She released his hand and pointed at him, then at herself, then made a motion like breaking something in half. The meaning was clear enough. Whatever those symbols meant, they were dangerous. For both of them. Over the next 3 days, she barely spoke. When she did, it was in her own language, words that flowed like water over stones, beautiful and incomprehensible. Kalen brought her food, changed her bandages, learned to read her expressions instead of waiting for words that wouldn't come. A slight nod meant yes, a flat stare meant no, a tilt of her head meant she was listening to something he couldn't hear. That last one happened often. She'd go still as death, eyes fixed on the barn wall, breathing shallow. Then she'd relax, satisfied that whatever she'd heard posed no threat. Kalen started listening too, straining to catch the sounds that put her on edge, riders in the distance, cracking branches, the cry of a hawk that might not be a hawk at all. He was learning her language without words, and somehow, impossibly, she was learning his. On the 4th morning, he brought her breakfast and found her sitting upright, the bandage removed, examining her wound with a critical eye. It had closed cleanly. No infection. She'd heal with nothing but a scar. She looked at him and spoke a single word in English. heavily accented, but unmistakable. Kalen. His name. She knew his name. He'd never told her, never told anyone out here, which meant she'd been conscious enough, aware enough to search his belongings while he slept, to learn who he was while he thought she was helpless. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like being seen for the first time in 7 years. She stood, tested her weight, nodded to herself. Then she looked at him with something that might have been regret. Kalen knew with sinking certainty that she was about to leave. She left that night without a sound. Kalen woke to cold air drifting through the barn door, the same door he'd latched before sleeping. He knew before he even looked that she'd be gone. The tarp hung loose. The grain sacks sat undisturbed. The space where she'd lain for 4 days showed only a faint impression in the straw. But she'd left something behind. A small leather pouch sat on the overturned crate he'd used as a makeshift table. Inside, dried herbs he didn't recognize, a carved piece of turquoise no bigger than his thumbnail, and a single feather bound with sinew. No note, no explanation. Just objects that clearly meant something in a language he couldn't speak. Kalen stood in the empty barn as dawn broke over the ridge, holding the pouch and feeling her absence like a physical weight. For 4 days, his world had contained another person, someone who didn't expect him to talk, who communicated in glances and gestures, who trusted him with her life. Now she was gone. And he was alone again. The silence felt different this time, heavier, like it had teeth. He went through his routines mechanically, fed the horses, checked the fence line, hauled water from the well, but his eyes kept drifting to the ridge, half expecting to see her silhouette against the sky, or worse, to see those riders returning with questions he still couldn't answer. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The wound on his palm where he'd cut himself fixing a gate healed faster than the strange, hollow feeling in his chest. He caught himself listening for sounds that never came. The rustle of someone moving in the barn, the cadence of a language he didn't understand, the weight of eyes watching him work. He started talking to himself just to break the silence, narrating his actions like a fool. Check the corral gate. Needs a new hinge. Maybe 2. The sound of his own voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. At night, he'd take out the leather pouch and examine its contents by lamplight, trying to decode their meaning. Medicine? A blessing? Payment? Or something else entirely? Something that required knowledge he'd never possess. The turquoise caught the light in strange ways. Sometimes blue, sometimes green, sometimes both at once. On the morning of the 32nd day, Kalen was mending fence when his horse suddenly lifted its head, ears forward, nostrils flaring. That stance meant only one thing: riders. His heart kicked against his ribs. Had those men returned? Had someone finally connected him to the Apache woman's disappearance? He reached for the post driver, the closest thing to a weapon, and turned toward the ridge. What he saw stopped his breath completely. Dozens of riders crested the hill in a perfect line, not scattered, not searching, deliberate, organized, moving with the precision of a military formation. And at their center, mounted on a paint horse, sat a figure he recognized even from a distance. Ayita had returned, but she hadn't come alone. She'd brought what looked like half her tribe, warriors in full regalia, horses adorned with feathers and beadwork, carrying lances that caught the morning sun like flames. They weren't attacking. They weren't charging. They were approaching his property with the formality of a delegation. And Kalen, who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another soul in 7 years, stood frozen in his yard as an entire Apache war party rode toward him in complete silence. They stopped 50 yards from his property line, not advancing, not retreating, just waiting in perfect formation, their horses standing as still as carved stone. Kalen's legs refused to move, His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand there like a target. But his body had locked up the way it always did when confronted with more than one person. This wasn't one person. This was an army. Ayita dismounted first. Even from a distance he could see how she moved, deliberate, controlled, fully healed. She'd been weak and bleeding the last time he saw her. Now she carried herself like someone who'd never known vulnerability. Two older men dismounted beside her. One carried a long staff decorated with feathers. The other wore elaborate clothing, his chest adorned with intricate beadwork and what looked like bone ornaments. A leader. Maybe her father. They began walking toward him. Kalen's throat closed completely. He couldn't have spoken if his life depended on it. And it might. For all he knew, this was revenge. Maybe hiding her had violated some sacred law. Maybe those symbols in the barn had been a death curse, and she'd returned to carry it out properly. His hand tightened around the post driver, a pathetic defense against 36 warriors. But it was all he had. Ayita reached the fence line first and stopped. She looked at him with those same intense eyes, but something had changed. The assessment was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like nervousness, which made no sense. She commanded warriors. He could barely manage a conversation with his own horse. The older man with the staff stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are Kalen Moss. You own this land." It wasn't a question, but Kalen nodded anyway. His hands shook visibly. He hoped they couldn't tell. "My name is Kuruk. I speak for our people." The old man gestured to the elaborately dressed warrior. "This is Dakota, leader of our band, and you know Ayita, daughter of Dakota, warrior of our tribe." Daughter? Of course. That explained the formal procession. They'd come for justice, for retribution. A white man hiding their leader's daughter could only mean one thing to them. "She has told us what you did," Kuruk continued. Kalen's heart hammered so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. "You gave shelter when she had none. You risked your life when men with weapons came searching. You asked for nothing, expected nothing. And when she was strong enough to leave, you did not try to keep her." The old man paused, letting the words settle. "In our tradition, such actions create a bond, a debt that must be honored. But Ayita does not wish to repay this debt in the way of warriors, with goods or service." Kuruk's expression shifted into something Kalen couldn't read. "She wishes to honor it in the way of her heart." Ayita stepped forward. She reached up and removed a necklace from around her neck. Turquoise and silver, clearly precious. Then she did something that made Kalen's mind go completely blank. She knelt. Not a crouch. Not a stumble. A deliberate, formal kneel in the dust of his yard, her head bowed, the necklace extended in both hands, like an offering. Kuruk spoke again, his voice carrying across the silent valley. "Ayita, daughter of Dakota, asks for your hand in the way of our people. She offers herself as wife, as partner, as the one who will stand beside you for all the days you both shall walk this earth." The world tilted sideways. Kalen couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was hearing. 36 Apache warriors watched him in absolute silence, waiting for an answer he had no idea how to give. Marriage. The word bounced around Kalen's skull like a trapped bird. She was asking him to marry her, in front of her father, in front of her entire tribe, in front of warriors who could cut him down before he took 3 steps. This had to be a test, some elaborate Apache trial where the wrong answer meant swift execution. Maybe she'd been ordered to do this. Maybe her father had demanded she repay the debt this way, and she was as trapped as he felt. But when Kalen forced himself to look at her, really look at her, he saw no resentment in her posture, no shame. She knelt in his yard with her head bowed, offering herself freely, and the only emotion visible on her face was hope. hope that he'd say yes. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. 7 years of self-imposed silence had calcified his voice into something useless. He tried again, forcing air past the knot in his throat. The word came out as a croak. I don't. Aita's head lifted slightly. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Kalen saw past the warrior, past the daughter of a chief, past the woman who'd bled in his barn. He saw someone who understood what it meant to be isolated, to be different, to communicate in ways that didn't require words. She'd chosen him, not because she had to, not because tradition demanded it, but because in 4 days of silence and shared space, she'd seen something in him worth keeping. Why? The word escaped before he could stop it. Kuruk translated. Aita responded in her own language, her voice steady and clear. The old man listened, then turned to Kalen. She says you gave her safety when you had every reason to fear. You touched her wounds with gentle hands when other men would have taken advantage. You asked for nothing and expected less. Kuruk paused. She says you are the first man who has seen her without trying to make her smaller, and that is worth more than all the warriors in our tribe combined. Kalen's vision blurred. He wasn't crying. He'd gone 7 years without crying, but his eyes burned anyway. I can't. He forced the words out. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't even know how to talk to people. Kuruk translated. Aita's response was immediate. She says she does not need words. She needs someone who will not run when she bleeds, someone who will stand between her and danger even when his hands shake. Someone whose first instinct is protection, not possession. The old man's expression softened. She says you have already proven yourself worthy. This ceremony is merely the formality. Behind Aita, Takoda remained expressionless. But his hand rested on the ornate weapon at his belt, not threatening, just present, a reminder that this moment carried weight beyond romance. Kalen's answer would forge or sever a connection between two worlds that rarely touched without bloodshed. He looked at the woman kneeling in his yard, at the tribe watching from their horses, at the life he'd built in isolation, safe and small and slowly suffocating. She was offering him something impossible, something terrifying, something he desperately wanted without knowing he'd been searching for it. Kalen dropped the post driver. It hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed across the silent valley. Then he took 3 steps forward, closing the distance between them, and did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He reached out first. His hand found hers. Her fingers closed around his with the same grip that had anchored her to life 4 weeks ago. And when he helped her to her feet, the warriors behind her began to chant, a rhythmic, ancient sound that rolled across the land like thunder. Kalen had said yes without speaking a word, and somehow, impossibly, she'd understood perfectly. The ceremony lasted until the sun reached its highest point. Kalen understood almost none of it. Kuruk translated the essential parts, the exchange of promises, the binding of hands with woven cord, the sharing of water from a carved wooden bowl, but most of the ritual unfolded in a language that flowed past him like a river, beautiful and incomprehensible. Aita stood beside him throughout, her hand steady in his. When the elders spoke, she responded with confidence. When they asked him questions through Kuruk, she waited patiently while he stammered through answers that felt inadequate. And when Takoda finally stepped forward and placed both hands on their joined wrists, his expression remained unreadable. The chief spoke at length. Kuruk translated in careful pieces. Takoda says his daughter has chosen a path he did not expect. But he has watched you, Kalen Moss. He sent scouts after his daughter disappeared. They reported that a white farmer turned away armed men with nothing but silence and stubbornness. The old man paused. He says there are many kinds of courage. The loudest is not always the strongest. Takoda released their hands and stepped back. The warriors lowered their lances in unison, a gesture that Kuruk explained meant acceptance, not approval, not celebration, just acknowledgement that the bond had been witnessed and sealed. Then, one by one, the tribe departed. They mounted their horses in the same perfect formation and rode back over the ridge, leaving Kalen and Ayata standing alone in the yard like survivors of a storm. The silence felt different now, charged with possibility instead of emptiness. Ayita turned to him and spoke carefully in English, each word deliberate. "We learn together." 4 words, more than she'd ever spoken to him in his language. Kalen's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting himself to respond. She walked toward the barn. He followed. Inside, she knelt beside the spot where she'd hidden weeks ago and brushed away the scattered hay, revealing the symbols she'd drawn in blood and dirt. They'd faded, but remained visible. 3 interconnected circles with lines radiating outward. Aida touched the first circle and said a word in her language. Then she pointed at Kalen and repeated it. She touched the second circle, pointed at herself, and said another word. Finally, she traced the third circle, the one that connected the other 2, and said something that sounded like a question. Kalen knelt beside her, studying the design. Slowly, understanding dawned. The first circle was him, the second was her, the third was the space they would create together. Not his world, not hers, but something new that required both of them to exist. He picked up a piece of charred wood from the cold fire pit and drew a 4th line connecting all 3 circles, completing the pattern. When he looked up, Aita was smiling. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. The expression transformed her entire face, softening the sharp edges of the warrior into something warm and startlingly vulnerable. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture so gentle it made his chest ache. That night they sat together outside the barn, watching stars emerge one by one across the endless sky. She taught him words in her language. He taught her more words in his. Most of what they communicated still happened without speech, through glances and small movements, and the comfortable silence of 2 people learning to occupy the same space. Kalen realized somewhere between midnight and dawn that he hadn't felt afraid once since the ceremony ended. The panic that usually gripped him around others had vanished, because Aita didn't need him to perform. She just needed him to be present, and for the first time in 7 years, being present felt like enough. But then, 3 days after the wedding, something changed. Kalen was hauling water from the well when he noticed Aita standing at the edge of the property, staring toward the ridge. Her posture had gone rigid, the same stance she'd taken in the barn when listening for danger. "What is it?" he managed to ask. She didn't answer, just kept staring. Then she spoke a single word in her language, soft and urgent. When he didn't understand, she tried in English. "Brother." Kalen's stomach dropped. "Your brother?" She nodded, still watching the ridge. "He comes. Is that bad?" Her silence was answer enough. Within the hour, a lone rider appeared. He didn't approach slowly or cautiously. He came at full gallop, his horse kicking up clouds of dust, and when he reached the property line, he didn't stop, just dismounted in a fluid motion and strode directly toward them. He was younger than Dakota, but carried the same air of authority. His face was hard, his eyes cold as they swept over Kalen and then fixed on Aita. He spoke rapidly in their language, his tone sharp and accusatory. Aita responded calmly, but Kalen could see the tension in her shoulders. The argument escalated. The brother's voice rose. He gestured at Kalen with obvious contempt, then said something that made Aita's expression go flat and dangerous. She snapped back a response that stopped her brother mid-sentence. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Kalen and switched to broken English. "You think you save her? You think you hero?" Kalen's throat closed. He shook his head, not trusting his voice. You not hero. The brother stepped closer. You weakness. She choose you because she ashamed of who she is, because she want to hide from her people, from her duty. That's not, Kalen started, but the words died. You cannot even speak. The brother's laugh was bitter. She marry man who cannot defend her, cannot stand with warriors, cannot. Aida moved between them in a flash, speaking rapid-fire words that made her brother take a step back. But he wasn't finished. Our people talk, he said, still in English so Kalen would understand. They say Takota's daughter brings shame. They say she choose white coward over her own kind. They say... Aida slapped him. The crack of it echoed across the yard. Her brother's head snapped to the side, and for a moment, no one moved. Then he looked at Kalen with something that might have been pity, or warning. She make choice, he said quietly. But choice have cost. Our people split. Some say she show new path. Others say she betray everything, and men who hunt her before? He shook his head. They not forget. They come back, and when they do, you think your silence protect her? He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Kalen stood frozen, his mind reeling. Aida turned to him, and for the first time since she'd returned with the tribe, he saw something in her eyes that looked like doubt. Or maybe fear. He's right, Kalen whispered. I can't protect you. I can barely... She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Then she took his hand and placed it over her heart. The message was clear. She'd made her choice. The question was whether he could live with the consequences of that choice, not just for himself, but for her. And for the first time since saying yes, Kalen wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The next week passed in uneasy quiet. Aida went about her routines, tending the animals, mending fences, preparing meals, but something had shifted. She watched the ridge more often, listened more intently to every distant sound. At night she barely slept, and when she did, she kept a knife within reach. Kalen tried to ask what was wrong, but his words came out clumsy and inadequate. She'd smile and shake her head, but the smile never reached her eyes. Then, on the 8th night after her brother's visit, they came. Kalen woke to Aida's hand clamped over his mouth. She put a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the window. Through the darkness, he could see shapes moving. 4, maybe 5 men, creeping toward the house with weapons drawn. The men who'd been hunting her. They'd returned. Aida moved silently, gathering her bow and quiver, then gestured for Kalen to stay down. But as she headed for the door, he grabbed her wrist. No, he whispered. It was possibly the firmest word he'd ever spoken to another person. She looked at him with surprise. Together, he said. For a moment he thought she'd argue, then she nodded and handed him the spare knife from her belt. They moved through the house like shadows. Aida positioned herself near the back door. Kalen took the front. The plan was simple. When the men tried to enter, they'd be caught between 2 defenders, but plans never survived contact with reality. The front door exploded inward, not kicked, blown open with such force that Kalen barely had time to dive aside before 2 men rushed in. He recognized one, the scarred man from weeks ago, the one who'd come searching for Aida. I knew it, the scarred man snarled. I knew you were hiding her. Kalen tried to speak, to explain, but his voice locked up completely. The other man laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. The mute's trying to talk. How sweet. They advanced. Kalen backed toward the center of the room, knife raised but shaking. He'd never fought anyone in his life, never even thrown a punch. 7 years of isolation had made him soft, and these men knew it. The scarred man lunged. Kalen stumbled backward, barely avoiding the blade that slashed past his ribs. He swung his own knife wildly, connecting with nothing but air. The second man circled behind him. They were herding him like an animal, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then, an arrow punched through the second man's shoulder. He screamed and dropped his weapon. Ayita stood in the doorway, another arrow already knocked, her expression cold as winter. "Outside," she said in English. "Now, or next one goes through his throat." The scarred man hesitated, weighing his options. Then he grabbed his wounded companion and dragged him toward the door. But he paused on the threshold and looked back at Kaylin. "You really think you can keep her? You think this ends here?" He spat blood. "She's a dead woman, and you're a dead man. Only question is when." They disappeared into the night. Ayita lowered her bow and turned to Kaylin. He expected relief in her eyes, or pride, or something positive. Instead, he saw resignation. "They come back," she said quietly. "More next time, many more." Kaylin's hands were still shaking. "Then we leave. We go somewhere they can't find us." "No place they cannot find." She set down her bow. "No place we run that is far enough." "Then what do we do?" She was silent for a long time. Then she said something that made Kaylin's blood run cold. "I go back." "What? No, you can't." "I go back to my people. I tell them I make mistake. I tell them you were kind, but wrong choice." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "They take me back. Men stop hunting. You live in peace." "No!" The word burst out of Kaylin with more force than anything he'd said in years. "You're not going back. You're not giving up what we have because of them." "What we have?" For the first time, anger flashed in Ayita's eyes. "What we have is me bringing death to your door. What we have is you shaking with knife in hand because you cannot fight. What we have is—" "Choice," Kaylin interrupted. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but steady. "What we have is the choice we both made, and I'm not letting you unmake it because I'm afraid. I've been afraid my whole life. I'm done." She stared at him. "You not done. You just beginning to be afraid. Real fear come when they return with 10 men, 20. When they burn your home and drag us both into yard and then we fight. You cannot fight. Then I'll learn." Kaylin took a shaking breath. "You learned my language. I can learn yours. You learned my ways. I can learn yours. You learned to see me as something more than broken. Maybe I can learn to see myself that way too." Ayita's expression cracked, just slightly. "Kaylin, I know I can't protect you the way a warrior would. I know I'm not brave. But I can stand beside you. I can refuse to let you face this alone. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what being strong actually means." She was quiet for a long time. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He felt her shaking, not with fear, but with something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope. "We fight," she whispered into his shoulder. "Together." But even as Kaylin held her, even as he felt the warmth of her against him, he couldn't shake the scarred man's words. "You're a dead man. Only question is when." And he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the real test was still coming. 3 months passed. 3 months of relative peace, but the kind of peace that felt like holding your breath underwater. You knew you'd have to surface eventually, and when you did, the world would still be waiting. Kaylin spent those months learning. Ayita taught him to track, to move quietly, to read the signs of the land. She taught him basic defensive moves with the knife, though they both knew he'd never be a warrior. But he was getting stronger, more confident. He could hold a conversation now without his throat closing. He could meet people's eyes. Small victories. But they accumulated. Kuruk visited twice more, bringing news from the tribe. The reception to Ayita's marriage remained split. Some saw it as a bridge between worlds. Others saw it as betrayal. And the men who'd attacked the house? They'd gone quiet. Too quiet. "They planned something," Kuruk said during his last visit. "Something big. Be ready." But how did you prepare for something when you didn't know what it was? The answer came on a cold morning in late autumn. Kalen was checking the fence line when he saw smoke rising from the direction of the nearest settlement, the small trading post where he'd occasionally gone for supplies. Thick, black smoke, the kind that came from buildings burning. His stomach dropped. He ran back to the house and found Aita already standing outside, staring at the smoke. "They not attack settlement," she said quietly. "They burn it to send message, to us." "What message?" She turned to him, and her eyes were hollow. "That nowhere is safe. That if we not face them, they destroy everything around us until we do." As if to confirm her words, a rider appeared on the ridge. Not one of the men who'd attacked before. This was a rider from the settlement, a man Kalen recognized from past trading visits. He rode hard, his horse lathered with sweat. He reined up at the property line, breathless. "They're saying it was Indians," he gasped out. "The men who burned the trading post. They're saying it was an Apache raid. They're forming a posse, going to ride into Apache territory and—" "It not Apache," Aita cut in. "It was white men dressed as Apache to start war." The rider stared at her, then at Kalen. You're harboring her?" "She's my wife," Kalen said. The words came easily now. "You're—" The rider's face went pale. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If people find out you married an Apache, if they think you're working with them—" "We're not working with anyone," Kalen said. "But we can stop this. We can prove it wasn't the Apache." "How?" That's when Aida spoke up, and what she said changed everything. "Because I know who burned settlement. I recognize horse from smoke smell, and I know where they hide." The rider's eyes went wide. You'd help us catch them?" "Not catch." Aida's expression was hard. "Kill." What happened next unfolded faster than Kalen could process. Aida sent word to her tribe through a method Kalen didn't understand, some kind of signal fire that Kuruk had taught her. Within hours, a dozen Apache warriors arrived, along with Kuruk and, surprisingly, her brother. The brother looked at Kalen with something that might have been respect, or maybe just grim acknowledgement. "You ready to fight?" he asked in his broken English. Kalen wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at him to hide, to run, to let others handle this. But Aida stood beside him, and he remembered what he'd told her. "I can stand beside you." "Yes," he said. They rode out before dawn, a strange mixed party of Apache warriors, settlers from the trading post, and one terrified farmer who could barely hold his rifle steady. Aida led them through the canyon to a hidden valley where she said the men would be camped. She was right. 5 men sat around a fire, celebrating their successful raid. The scarred man was among them, laughing as he recounted how easy it had been to make it look like an Apache attack. "Stupid settlers believed it immediately," he was saying. "By tomorrow, they'll be riding into Apache territory, and we can pick off both sides while they tear each other apart." The plan was simple but brutal. Start a war between settlers and Apache, then profit from the chaos. Classic divide and conquer. But they hadn't counted on the two groups uniting. The attack was swift and decisive. The Apache warriors moved like shadows. The settlers, driven by rage at being manipulated, fought with grim determination. And Kalen found himself face to face with the scarred man. The man recognized him immediately. "The mute! Come to die properly this time?" He lunged with his knife. Kalen's mind went blank. All the training Aida had given him vanished. His body locked up the way it always had. The knife was coming toward his throat. Then Aida's voice cut through the chaos. "Kalen! Duck!" He dropped without thinking. An arrow hissed over his head and caught the scarred man in the chest. He stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock, and fell. Kalen stared at the body, then at his shaking hands. He hadn't been able to do it. Even with everything at stake, he'd frozen. He was still broken. But when Aida reached him, She didn't look disappointed. She looked proud. "You ducked," she said simply. "You trusted. You listened. That is strength, too." The battle ended quickly after that. The remaining men were captured and turned over to the settlement's makeshift law. Evidence was found in their camp, stolen Apache artifacts they'd been planning to scatter at future attack sites, documents outlining their plan to start a war. The truth came out. The settlements realized they'd been manipulated. The Apache realized the settlers could be allies instead of enemies. And Kalen realized something about himself. He'd never be a warrior. He'd never be the kind of man who could charge into battle without fear. But maybe that was okay. Maybe strength came in different forms. Maybe his strength was in choosing to stand despite the fear, in trusting others when his instinct was to hide, in building bridges instead of burning them. On the ride back, Aita's brother rode up beside Kalen. "I was wrong," he said in careful English. "You not weakness. You different kind of strong. The kind my sister need." It was the closest thing to an apology Kalen had ever received. He'd take it. Word of what happened spread quickly. Within weeks, the story had transformed into something larger than life. The mute farmer and the Apache warrior who united two peoples and stopped a war. It wasn't quite that simple, of course. The reality had been messier, more complicated, more terrifying than any story could capture. But stories had their own truth. And the truth in this story was that Kalen and Aida had chosen each other, not once, but over and over again, despite fear, despite doubt, despite every reason to give up. The homestead changed over the following years. It became a kind of neutral ground, a place where Apache and settlers could meet and trade peacefully. Kuruk visited often, teaching anyone who wanted to learn the Apache language and customs. Aida taught women in the settlement how to track and survive in the wilderness. And Kalen, somehow, became the unlikely mediator, the man whose silence had taught him to listen better than most people who spent their lives talking. He never became comfortable with crowds, never lost that instinct to hide when too many people gathered. But he learned to push through it, to choose connection over isolation. 5 years after that night in the barn, Kalen stood in his yard watching the sunset with Aita beside him. Their daughter, 3 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet nature, played near the fence line, chattering happily in a mix of English and Apache. "You ever regret it?" Kalen asked. It was a question he'd been too afraid to voice before. "Regret what?" "Choosing me, giving up your life as a warrior, dealing with all this." He gestured vaguely at himself. Aita was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand. "When I was bleeding in your barn," she said, "I thought I would die. I made peace with it. But then you came. And you did not see warrior. You did not see Apache. You did not see enemy or stranger. You saw a person who needed help. And you gave it." She squeezed his hand. "That night, you saved my life. But every day since, you saved something more important. You saved my faith that there is good in people, that different worlds can touch without destroying each other. That love is stronger than fear." She looked at their daughter, then back at him. "So no, I not regret. Not single moment." Kalen felt something unlock in his chest, some final piece of doubt that had been holding on, refusing to let go. "I love you," he said. The words came easily now. "I know," she replied with that rare, transformative smile. "You tell me every day, even when you not speak." As the sun dipped below the ridge and the stars began to emerge, Kalen thought about the man he'd been 7 years ago. Silent, isolated, convinced he was broken beyond repair. That man would never have believed this was possible. But here he was, married, a father, a bridge between worlds, still quiet, still sometimes afraid, still fumbling through conversations like a man learning a new language, but no longer hiding, and that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this story of courage, connection, and second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what you think. Would you have opened the barn door that night? Could you have said yes to the impossible? Share your thoughts below and check out our other frontier stories where ordinary people face extraordinary choices. Your support keeps these tales alive, so consider leaving a super chat if this one touched your heart. Until next time, remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to be seen.